Today we are going to be investigating biodiversity. Go ahead and turn to page 4 in your Life Science Review packet. You'll see it says Biodiversity Note Sheet on the top. Let's first look at two words that have become very important today when we discuss biodiversity. The first word is survival rate. Survival rate is the number of individuals alive after a period of time. Extinction, then, is looking at the groups that did not survive over time. Extinction is the end of an organism or a group of organisms. Today, when we talk about biodiversity, we're going to be talking about an animal's survival rate based off of adaptations that happen over time, or how an animal may become extinct. So, how important is it for an organism to adapt for survival? When we talk about adaptations, we need to be looking at the anatomical parts of an animal. So, what does anatomical mean? Anatomical means you're looking at certain parts of a structure of an organism. It could be anything from the structure of their hands to their height, to their bone density, to how certain muscles are attached. All of those things are anatomical parts of a structure. Now, what happens over time is we end up having variations happening in the actual anatomical parts of the structure. What this means is you could have a whole batch of giraffes that are all born, but one giraffe anatomically has a longer neck than all of the other giraffes. This, of course, is a variation, a mutation in the actual anatomical part of that organism. What ends up happening over time is the organism that ends up having a mutation or adaptation that's different than their peers, that actually ends up being beneficial for survival, ends up meaning that that animal could live longer or have more offspring than those around them. And this bleeds into what we call natural selection. Natural selection, you'll see the definition for this. This is actually above the image of the giraffes. You will define natural selection as a gradual, non-random process by which biological traits become either more or less common in a population. Now, animals cannot control these biological changes. They happen in their genes. So what this means through natural selection is that the traits that are a variation, like maybe a giraffe being born with a longer neck than all of its peers, will end up living longer, possibly because it doesn't have to work as hard to obtain food, or it can get food from a higher height than other animals around it. Because this giraffe gets to live longer, that means it has more opportunities to mate, and the more it gets to mate, the more offspring it has. And if those offspring all have this genetic variation of having a longer neck, then they too will have an advantage, and they too will live longer and have more offspring, until what we end up seeing is that our current giraffes now have a longer neck due to this slight change or mutation in the genes. Look at this image here. Do you see how we have 6 different types of ladybugs? Which of these ladybugs do you think would survive the best in a brown environment, like living on a brown tree? Of course, it will be the ladybug with the adaptation that has more of a light brown color or structure. While this ladybug, because it is black, will stand out on a brown tree and it will be eaten by predators quicker, meaning that it doesn't get to live as long and reproduce as much and has less offspring with the trait of being black. Let's look at this. Look at these birds. These are all finches. So they all derive from the same family of birds. However, notice that their beaks are all different. We can assume that the different beak sizes on the birds actually help them to survive. Maybe it allowed them to be able to crack open shells, eat small berries. And we start looking. So now we are going to be looking at terms associated with biological diversity. Let's first look at question number 1. Why is variation important to the process of natural selection? Well, remember that variation are those little differences that happen among genes. We call them mutations. And some of these variations actually allow individuals in a species to actually survive while others perish. So why is variation important for a species' survival? This is because the variations that are best suited for the nature in which the animal is living allows that animal to actually live longer or have more mates, which then means that that characteristic will continue to be in the gene pool. So the animals that are the most fittest, right, they have the best genes, will end up having the most number of offspring. And the more offspring that you have, the more people you have to continue on that genetic mutation or adaptation. Let's look at some more examples of this. Let's look at this moth. So here you can see that there's a lot of pollution currently happening, and so the moths are living along darker surfaces. Do you see how it's easier for the bird to see the moth that is whiter in color because it stands out? So as the changes in the environment continues to happen, there was a balance between white and black moths. However, the moths that were white were easier to be seen by animals, and then they were eaten. While the moths that were black were harder to see. So the black moths got to have more offspring than the white moths did, because the white moths were dying quicker. What this ends up meaning is that over time, the white moths didn't have as much of an opportunity to reproduce while the black moths did, and so this became the most common trait in the moth family, is to have a dark color. Let's look at this in another way. Here we have 4 different birds, pairs, and they're all the same type of bird, right? You can see that they all look identical. And each of these birds ends up going to different islands. These birds fly to their little islands, and they end up living there, right? In seclusion. And these birds will continue to mate and reproduce. What we'll see, though, is that over time, these birds begin to change. We begin to see variations. The variations in the birds happen due to adaptations in their genes. Now look at these birds. You can see that I have placed this bird on this island where it has the tiny, hard-to-reach seeds, because this bird, over time, has adapted to have a longer, pointier beak. What kind of bird do you think is going to live where there's an island with tiny seeds? If you said a bird with a short beak, you'd be correct. Now, which of these 2 birds do you think is going to be on the island with the large, hard-shelled seeds or the medium-sized seeds? Notice that as time passes, the birds look different, but they have common ancestors. The beaks of the birds did not change. There are variations in the population, and the birds with the best variations survived and passed on the genes to the offspring. Variations in beak size and shape resulted in birds that could eat the kinds of food available on that island. So, why should we care about variations today? Well, think about when you have a virus and you end up having to take antibiotics. If there is a mutation in an individual strain of bacteria, not a virus, that can be resistant to antibiotics, what will begin to happen over time? The antibiotics will end up killing the bacteria that is not resistant to it. However, that one strain of that bacteria that can actually be resistant to antibiotics begins to survive and have the ability to reproduce. So, with the normal bacteria dead, the resistant bacteria can multiply and become more and more common until we end up with a strain of bacteria that is actually resistant to antibiotics, which means that they're no longer effective. When we think about current medicine practices and maybe the overuse of antibiotics, you can now see why people get concerned about doctors overprescribing antibiotics. So let's review. Put these in order. When we look at things like adaptations over time, what must happen first? You must first have an individual with a favorable characteristic or mutation. From that, we can see that that individual then has the ability to survive and reproduce. If they can survive and reproduce, then you can see that the mutation becomes a part of the gene pool in the species that evolve after it. So the offspring with this favorable characteristic will continue to survive until eventually this characteristic is the most common characteristic among future generations. Of course, this process takes a lot of time. This is not something that happens overnight. It happens over hundreds of thousands of years. So let's review. The fit moths. What is their goal when it comes to survival? You should say to be able to blend in with their environment. What is a variation? A variation can be neutral, helpful, or harmful. D, all of the above is the correct answer. Sometimes animals have variations that are neutral. It doesn't harm the animal and it doesn't help the animal. Sometimes animals can have adaptations that are harmful to them, and that means that the animal ends up actually dying prior to its prime in life, which means it doesn't get to reproduce. Oftentimes, these variations that are harmful do not end up moving along the evolutionary chain because the animal dies prior to having the opportunity to have offspring. Which means that most variations that benefit an animal end up allowing that animal to live longer and have more offspring, which means that future offspring carry that gene until this becomes the dominant gene in the gene pool. This is now biological diversity and adaptations notes. Please notice on the bottom of your note-taking sheet, you can see some benefits of having adaptations that are different than the animals around you. Tomorrow we will be discussing this more in class, and we will be doing 2 labs related to biological adaptations.